So early marriage is not a personal tragedy for the individual girl or her family. So it is also a public issue.
Hello, and welcome to episode 53 of What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Friday, November 14. Today, I am delighted to feature an interview with Khin Hnin Phyu Soe, a freelance journalist who researched and published a recent story about how underage girls in Myanmar are increasingly marrying to avoid conscription. But before we get to that, let me cover three key developments in the news this week. First up, the military regime's demolition of buildings at the KK Park scam compound continued over the last week. And despite the fact that the Thailand military last week filed a complaint against the Myanmar regime through the Thai Myanmar Township Border Committee, complaining over debris from the demolitions landing in Thailand. Despite that, it continued this week, with debris from demolition landing near Mae Sot, damaging 6 homes on Thai territory. And according to the Myanmar regime, military-controlled media, that is, the military does plan to destroy more. In fact, they claim they will destroy all the buildings in KK Park. Reports of the exact numbers of buildings that have already been dismantled, they vary, but it looks like around a quarter of the total structures have been damaged so far. Agency France Presse used satellite imagery to claim that KK Park's central section, however, remains undamaged. That section continued to expand this year, even after Thailand authorities cut internet and electricity to Myanmar in February. This week, Frontier actually published a feature story on the fate of KK Park. The Myanmar military's raid on the compound before these demolitions did result in thousands of arrests and a lot of equipment being confiscated by the military. But analysts say the operation was an empty spectacle by the regime merely to create the impression that it's cracking down on the scam industry. Check that out on the Frontier website. And in related scam news, on Wednesday, the United States Department of Treasury sanctioned the Democratic Karen Benevolent Army, the DKBA, and 4 of its senior leaders for their alleged involvement in cyber scam operations in Karen State that they say targeted US citizens. The department said the Tai Chang scam compound in DKBA territory in Myanmar Township targets US citizens, and that the DKBA not only provides security at the compound, but also tortures workers or prisoners there. The US government estimates that US citizens lost at least $10 billion to scams that were based in Southeast Asia last year. That's a 66% increase compared to the year of 2023. The Treasury Department announced this week that the United States government would also launch a, quote, scam center task force that will direct agencies and attorneys to investigate, disrupt, and prosecute Southeast Asian scam centers. Reportedly, the strike force has already deployed FBI, that's Federal Bureau of Investigation, agents to Thailand to combat the scam compounds in Myanmar and elsewhere. And the strike force has, quote, a remit to use all government tools available in its mission. How this United States task force factors into the dynamic of Chinese pressure on Thailand and Myanmar and the military's vested interests in keeping the scam industry going remains to be seen. Second, we now know that at least 27 passengers from Myanmar on a boat carrying around 70 people drowned last Thursday when their vessel capsized in the Indian Ocean near the Malaysian island of Langkawi, which is by the Thailand-Malaysia border. 13 people were rescued by teams from Thailand and Malaysia. Apparently, this boat took its passengers from another larger boat that departed Arakan Army-controlled Butidong around 3 weeks ago, and the vast majority of the passengers were Rohingya. Another boat with around 230 people on it still remains unaccounted for. Data from the United Nations Refugee Agency shows that more than 5,000 Rohingya people used boats to leave Myanmar and Bangladesh between January and November this year, and nearly 600 of those have since been reported dead or missing. A Rohingya refugee in Cox's Bazar, Nasser Khan, he spoke to Reuters about the deaths. He said, quote, "People are dying in fighting. People are dying from hunger. Some think it's better to die at sea than to die slowly here." And third, the military continued regaining lost ground from resistance groups in Mandalay region over this past week. Last Friday, the military took control of the Sedorji Dam from the Mandalay People's Defence Force, PDF, which has been on the back foot for months now, steadily losing control of infrastructure, mines, and territory. The biggest prize in Mandalay region is still Mogok, which remains in resistance hands. The Mandalay and Mogok PDFs say they'll cooperate to defend Mogok once the Ta'ang National Liberation Army abandons it and the town of Mongmek in the coming weeks, in line with their recent ceasefire brokered by China. But this prospect of an attack on the PDF-held city of Mogok has spooked locals, and this week thousands of people have been fleeing the city, mostly for Mandalay and Jalmer. The military also had another key strategic victory this week in Chin State, retaking the Taingen outpost, which is located at a junction linking the towns of Falam and Didim. Controlling the outpost gives the military a tactical advantage over key transport routes linking the lowland Sagaing town of Galei to Falam and Didim. Last week, the military, on November 4, recaptured Kennedy Peak, and with the takeover of the Taingen outpost this week, it now holds key positions in the area for observation and to enable further attacks. More than half of Chin State is still in resistance hands, including the town of Falam. And it must be mentioned that this was a particularly deadly week for civilians nationwide, with the Myanmar military killing, on first count, 21 civilians and injuring at least 40 others through torture, artillery, and air, drone, and gyrocopter strikes across Sagaing, Magwe, and Mandalay regions, and Rakhine and Kachin states. Townships affected included Pakat, Minbya, Myang, Bonajun, Paukdo, and Singu townships. But also, last Thursday, a military gyrocopter crashed in Bago region's Pyu township after bombing Majikon village and killing a man there in his 50s. The crash seemed to be a result of mechanical failure and killed both pilots. Before the gyrocopter bombing, the military had carried out artillery strikes and drone attacks on the village. A resistance fighter told media outlet Myanmar Now, quote, "They've recently started using gyrocopters and suicide drones in areas where we haven't had any clashes. Gyrocopters are a newer addition to the Myanmar Air Force. They're much cheaper than jets and more maneuverable, lower to the ground, enabling surveillance, but also less safe for their occupants." And after another week of reporting on the Myanmar military's victories on the ground, it's worth noting the military's advantages on the battlefield are directly related to its ability to conscript the most vulnerable people in the areas it controls. And military analysts estimate up to 70,000 people have been conscripted into military service since the regime launched its conscription policy at the beginning of 2024. Late last month, Frontier published a feature story highlighting one way that underage girls are attempting to shield themselves or be shielded from the draft. They're getting married. I'm delighted to have the author of that piece on the show now to talk about how conscription is affecting women and girls in military-ruled Myanmar. Hello, Khin Hnin Phyu Soe.
Thank you for having me.
It's really terrific to have you here. And thank you for publishing this really important article with Frontier. I think it's particularly great when readers, especially those who are outside of Myanmar, when readers are provided with this kind of insight into how military rule and conscription are affecting people's everyday lives in Myanmar. So let's get started. You write that Myanmar women are increasingly marrying young to avoid military service. But also, until now, it's mostly been men who have been targeted for conscription. Of course, women can be targeted in the law. So what's the situation now for women living in military-controlled areas? Are they being targeted for conscription now too, more than before?
Yeah. Sure, my reports from Frontier, Between Fear and Survivor, the rise of child marriage in Myanmar, look at how the military regained enforcement to conscription. Together with the collapse of security, education, and livelihood, is pushing teenagers, especially young girls, into areas of forced marriage. For my story, I call it a real-life testimony from young woman, the family who has been directly affected. I also spoke to women rights activists, child protection groups, the legal expert. These marriages intersect with the construction law, the child rights law, and the wider humanitarian crisis in the country. For your question, yes, it is the beginning. The military mainly targeted men for construction. The law on paper made both men and women eligible. Men aged 18 to 35 and the woman aged 18 to 27. But during the first year of enforcement, the regime focused almost entirely on men. This created the perception that women were safer and would not be called at. But the perception has changed very quickly over the past few months. The junta has now made female military training cycle public, and families starting to receive questionnaire and the draft list that include woman name. Even without a nationwide survey, the evidence from women organization and safe house is consistent. They are seeing more cases for young women at risk. That's why the story of Nanki and Julia became important, I think.
Yes, and in your story, you go into the experiences of these two women, Nan Ki and Julia.
Yeah, Nanki is a 70 years old girl who was visited by the military personnel at her family residence to conduct a census. The officer recorded her name that alone terrified her mother. The family could not afford the monthly payment the officer demand for that list, so they don't know find a safe place to hide. Less than a week after the visit, Nanki and her boyfriend got married in the hope of avoiding military service. Yeah, and then another story. In the Kachin state, Julia's younger sister, only 60, was pushed into marriage because her boyfriend, who is 19, appearance on the construction list. He is only son in a family. So they feared losing him. The marriage was arranged quickly, even though both teenagers said they were not ready. These are not the isolated story, that this show the family are changing their children's life overnight when they see military service as an immediate threat. So women are increasingly being targeted in both law and practice, and even the fears of construction is already alternated girl future, I think, yeah.
So the conscription law, in your view, is really starting to alter the future of teenage girls, of course, in an environment already where education has been severely interrupted. Okay, I wanted to pivot now. Analysts, they estimate around 70,000 people have been conscripted already since the policy was started at the beginning of last year, and the majority, vast majority, nearly all of those are men. And yet many men have managed to avoid or escape conscription. What methods have people been using up until now to get around the draft?
Yeah, it's true. Men options are extremely limited. Then the most of them undermine fairness, dignity, and even safety. In practice, men use a few strategies. First, bribery. It's one of the most common, Wealthier family sometimes makes monthly payment to local administrator or village leader. So their surname is ignored or removed from the list. Quite. These payments are unofficial, of course. And then amount vary in some area. People told me it can be 50,000 to 100,000 jet per month, an amount completely out of reach for ordinary rural household. So this immediately create inequality. So with the money can buy protection or those without an export. Another option is fleeing. Some young men are run to the area outside of hunter control, so try to cross illegally into neighboring country. But this is the dangerous for many reasons. They risk arrest for the checkpoint, deportation, or ending at the exploited condition. So there are also real concern about trafficking when people try to escape through informal routes. A smaller number choose to join resistant group, ethnic and organization instead of serving the hunter. But the most people, this is not a true choice. And of course, it's carry major physical and emotional risk, right? Some men try to seek examination, for example, like a registration as a student or claiming dependent. But the gender rules are broad, inconsistent, and they often apply unfairly. What works in one township might not work in another township. So finally, they choose the marriage can also to be a strategy. In some cases, married men or men with children are granted exemption. So family know that. So they will sometimes encourage a son to marry early or quickly, even when he stayed a teenager or whatever, just to avoid the military. Overall, these options are uneven. They depend heavily on wealth, connection, geography, and luck. So for poor rural household, the choices are basically they only can pay, flee, or marry. So which can have very serious long-term consequences.
Right. Pay, flee, or marry. And what else did you learn about all of this, Khin?
Reporting for this story has taught me that early marriage is a contest. It's not driven mainly by traditional or the culture. In most of the case, I encountered this very well. Practical response or fear. The family felt pressure and choose what they believe was the safest option, even it means it's not sacrifice their daughter's future. Yeah, I also learned that this is not an isolated issue, it's structural. Women organization, shelter, and community network across different parts of the country have reported seen more cases. Even though we don't have yet nationwide statistical survey, I can't find any survey, but the qualitative evidence, the testimony, the patterns, it's strong, the consistent. We have to take this seriously. So another thing I learned is how many layers of vulnerable existed before consistent even began. Because of years of school closer due to the COVID-19, right? So economic collapse, displacement, and the limited access to legal protection. So it's already narrowing people's choices. The military construction law became the tripping point. The 10, though existing vulnerability into life changes, offer a reversible decision, I think. For especially the psychological and intergenerational impact are also much deeper than they appear. So it means girls who marry young lose the chance of finish their education, face higher risk of domestic violence, and often carry trauma into adulthood. That the trauma affect their children too. In the long term, this created consequence not only for the individual but also for entire community and for the country development. Finally, I learned that the family are not acting out of neglect or indifference. They are exhausted. because they choose very limited, very dangerous option. The child marriage is still unacceptable.
So this is a new structural problem on top of the existing vulnerabilities for girls in military-ruled Myanmar. And you mentioned some already, but what are the consequences? What are more of the consequences of teenage marriage for young women?
Yeah, the consequences are I mentioned about that, and then it's the first and the most immediate impact. It's education. Once a girl she marries, she almost leaves school. Without education, she have far fewer opportunity for independent livelihoods. This increased economic dependency trapped many young women in a cycle of poverty. There are also serious health risks. Adolescent girls, I think, the face much higher dangers during pregnancy and childbirth, especially in a country where the health system is already weak, like Myanmar. Early marriage contributes to higher mental and infant mortality, along with the long-term complication for both mother and child also. The psychology effects are equally significant. So early marriage, especially when it is forced, rash, involved violence, can lead exactly to the depression, anxiety, PTSD, and chronic stress. So young brides often have very little decision-making power without the household, which increase their vulnerability of domestic violence and sexual exploitation. So this impact continues to the next generation. So children born to very young mothers are more likely to experience malnutrition, poor early development, and lower school attendance like that. So even at the society level, they are consequent. What a large number of girls who lose their adolescent to marriage, the country lose future leader, health worker, and the community voices. So early marriage is not a personal tragedy for the individual girl or her family. So it is also a public issue. So if affect the health of communication, the strategy of education system, and the ultimately the futures of the country, I think. Yeah.
And I know how difficult all of this is, but are there any support services available at all for young girls who find themselves in this situation?
For my research, support does exist, but it is extremely and even and often very difficult to access, because of the country condition. There's a cross-border women group, local NGO, and the Safe House, especially along the Thai-Myanmar border. They provide like a shelter, counseling, and the limited legal support. But many of these now would operate inside Myanmar because open civil society war is dangerous and the military regime. These groups are often the only lifeline for the girl fleeing forced marriage or domestic abuse. So local women, foreign and community groups play as an important role. So they collect information, document causes, offer referral, and sometimes intervene directly to help family negotiate safer options. There's also CDM judges, lawyer, and the human rights activity who provide free legal advice. They explain what the Child Rights Act and the Banned Code said about forced marriage, age of consent, and the legal protection. But even in my knowledge, enforcement under military rule is weak, inconsistent, and often dangerous. uh, some UN agency and international NGO like monitoring the situation and run targeted program, but their asset to regain control area it's extremely limited. So it's depend on the geography, security, funding, and whatever group can safely operate in a given area. In many Euro regions, conflict zone service and minimal or completely absent. So I think that for the support exist, but they are not unmatched. They are underfunded. Frank Rashmad and they cannot replace political solution. I think what is the safe legal pathway, continuous education, better economic support for family. And the most important is forced military service and requirement for minor, I think, yeah.
Yeah, this, forced recruitment, this conscription policy that the military regime brought in at the beginning of last year has really reshaped the entire family, social, dynamic for so many parts of Myanmar. And this is just one example of that. How do you think that the conscription policy is affecting other parts of Myanmar society?
How can I say? Yeah, it's true. The rise of the child marriage to avoid military service is not like a family decision. It's a symptom or wider call or protection system in Myanmar. This is not like a something. It's like a humanitarian aids alone can solve. So it means there are credible organization and network doing like a shelter, legal age group, cross-border educator, and community women group. But they need resolve. So it means we must continue to push for the end of legal construction, force requirements of minor, the restriction of movement, like this prior choice. The story of like Nanki and Julia show what's happening, what's option disappear. Family are not choosing early marriage because they want to. They are choosing it because the state have removed every other safe path. That's why, as a reporter, for our responsibility, like activators and listener, it's not only for the document to hand, but to advocate for the protection and dignity of Myanmar girls and also in Myanmar people.
Definitely. And I and this podcast's audience all have so much respect for reporters going about things like you are, Khin. And thank you for researching and writing this story, and for joining What's Happening in Myanmar to talk about it with me. We've put the link to your publication in the show notes below this episode, so please, if you haven't read it, go and have a listen. And I really look forward to seeing what you write next. Thank you, Khin Hnin Phyu Soe.
Thank you for your having me, and thank you for the chance to talk about like underage marriage happening in Myanmar. That's really helpful and really okay for me. Thank you so much.
And remember, listeners, you can support reporters like Khin by subscribing to one of the independent media outlets that includes Frontier Myanmar. It's really important to keep funding not just the daily grind of reporting, but also the ability for journalists to take a step back and look at these longer-term issues in Myanmar society, like underage marriage. If you subscribe to Frontier, of course, you'll get access to these feature stories, but also daily briefing newsletters, media monitoring, that's translations of Burmese news into English, and Political Insider newsletters, not to mention events in person and online. But that brings us to the end of another episode of What's Happening in Myanmar. Remember, you can email the show, whimyanmar@proton.me. We love receiving your feedback. Until next week, farewell and take care.